Something like that was always ridiculous because the reason United States can listen in on Merkel's conversations was because they all use technology from Silicon Valley, which is full of those mechanisms of listening or copying, so forth. They're all going to back away from the United States. Number one, because it's dangerous, but number two, because China and the BRICS is now a larger economic unit. I'm aware of African countries creating a mission to go to the advanced part of the world to get money for a railroad they want to build and a harbor. Okay. They go to Washington, London, Paris. They make their presentations. They sit down with the minister and the bankers, and they get an offer. But then they don't go home with the offer. They fly directly to New Delhi, Beijing, Sao Paulo, and they basically do the same song and dance again. And then they say to both of them, "Who's going to give me the better offer? Will you build this many kilometers of rail of this kind ending in a harbor that you will dig out? The Chinese offer them a better deal that's it. It's just a better deal. It isn't a better deal that we have to think about. It's an obviously better deal. So even the ones that are not interested who busily take the deal with China and then send a special delegation of the vice premier to Washington to calm the people in Washington. We're not, don't worry that that's what's going on. So one side is becoming richer by the minute relative to the other, and the other is becoming more problematic with its rules. It's herky-jerky politics. You can't know whether Mr. Trump will raise or lower the tariff. Notice what he's done. He's made everybody aware that not only is there a tariff, but you can't know what the tariff is. It can be delayed. It can be suspended. It can be raised. Can be lowered. You have an agreement. What difference does it make? Canada and Mexico had very complex agreements with the United States, made very little difference. Still makes very little difference. So I think the whole world is in the process of readjustment, and that readjustment, here's the punchline. The United States set out after World War II to isolate the Soviet Union as their great danger, and they did a pretty good job of doing that. Now, the world reacting to what it saw is watching the United States continue to try to contain what it can no longer contain. And so the end result of what the United States is doing is to isolate itself. That is the irony of the historic moment. We are isolating us. We are creating more and more of a pressure outside the United States to encapsulate the United States. Let the United States go and be over there. Let the rest of the world get on with it. Even the Europeans are wondering about the deals they maybe ought to be making with China and India. And they're making some. And they understand we may have bet on the wrong horse, and it looks like now. And inside the United States, the same awareness could take the following form. That what we need in the world is not to allow the juggernaut of what's left of the United States and its allies to be in an endless military arms race with these others who are bigger than we are. Much bigger. And then to take a page from American history and say the British tried to stop us from being independent. The wars of 1776. They tried again in 1815. They were defeated by the United States both times, after which a deal was made. A deal. And the deal was, okay, Britain, you have the whole world. We take Latin America, and on that basis we should not bump into each other. You are crazy if you keep fighting British versus French versus... Yeah, and they did, and they made World War out of it, but the United States stayed away, busily taking its... Well, that kind of deal is no longer available in the world, but another deal between the behemoth here who's dying and isolated and the new emergence. The question may be not whether the Americans are willing to do it. The question may become, are the Chinese and the Indians willing to do it to come to an agreement that limits them both on the grounds that that's a way to avoid the war that ends the whole conversation. Every American president from now on, every politician aspiring is now going to have been taught a lesson. When the American economy is squeezed by its problems, take it out on Europe. Make Europe pay money. Make Europe suffer consequences. Do things that are good for your economy, or at least for how you posture as a politician here by smiting the Europeans, and many and any other culture that you can think of to treat. I mean, United States bears a lot of guilt for the damage it did in Vietnam. It then hits Vietnam with an enormous tariff. You know, as if there weren't any history that maybe ought to mitigate. If you get away with this, you are instructing the political classes of this country to look in those directions. Even if you don't want to call it tribute now, it's going to be pursued as a vehicle for solution. And let me give you the flip side of that. If Mr. Trump imposes a tariff on nearly every country, which he's done more or less, every politician, every leader of every country now has an argument they didn't have before. Whatever their domestic economic problems, and every country has them. They can now blame the United States. No matter who you are as a politician, you know, Mr. Trump, he hit us with and you can turn on the United States and make it into the rogue oppressor of the people of the world. Yesterday, the foreign ministers of China and India met, and they endorsed free trade, the WTO. Everything that Trump is undoing, they are now the champions of. Okay, this is a positioning of the BRICS as the anti-Trump, at a time when this is very good for the BRICS and very bad for the United States. These are very costly, deep, long-term mistakes that are being made. And let me give you one more, because it's very important to the politics emerging on the left, both in Europe and here. Mr. Trump, as you rightly notice, is leading the shift away from globalization and free trade and all of that to a protectionist, interventionist, powerful government, okay? As long as we don't have an economic downturn, that works for him. But the problem is, when we have the next economic downturn, the man in charge is going to attract an awful lot of the blame, even the parts that he's not responsible for. Everyone will be pointing at him. He's the logical person to blame, and there's a long history in this country of doing that. Every time Mr. Trump ran for office, he blamed whoever was in power. Obama the first time, Biden the second, and the Democrats do the same thing. That's our culture of politics. So, normally you would blame Trump, but he is so much more the direct intervener at every point, that the blame, look, the Democrats right now have no strategy other than the following. We do nothing. We wait for Mr. Trump to implode, and then we will walk into the White House and we'll walk into the Congress because the people will suffer and they'll blame him, and we will simply have to say, we're not him. That's their plan. Look, that may work for them. However, I do think that I see now more serious organization outside of the Democratic Party on the political left than I have ever seen in my lifetime here in the United States. You don't have it yet in the form of the new political party Corbyn and his allies are setting up in England. And you don't see it yet in the Blonde movement on the September 10th in France. But be careful, it is developing here. It will take time. I'm going to overstate it, but I'm seeing recognition, awareness, willingness to speak up. I mean, to be honest. The standing joke that people on the left in America now say to each other as we all experience the rise of our political fortunes is, we are grateful because Donald Trump is the best organizer we have right now. The employer-employee relationship is stunningly successful in China. This is not an endorsement of China. I understand China has its problems and its contradictions plenty. But if the world in the last 2 centuries has been busy crawling out from under colonialism as the way the world was organized, it then follows that the overwhelming mass of people living in Asia, Africa, and Latin America have as their probable number 1 priority not being poor anymore, or to say it difficultly achieving economic development as rapidly as they can. Well, then the China is the success story. There's really no issue here. If you're looking for a model, that's where you would go. You might want to choose something else. If you have some special other reason, or you have different values, that's possible. But if, and to the extent that you want a dynamic growing capitalism, the very thing that the United States throughout the 20th century boasted, it had achieved relative, say, to Europe, well then, now you have to move to China. You have to understand that capitalism is dynamic there, and it is not here, and the signs of it are everywhere. This morning, we all woke up here in the United States to a new study which shows that the CEO of the Starbucks coffee chain has an earns per year over 6,000 times more than the median employee of Starbucks earns. And why is that important? Because it's emblematic, and the research shows that we are living in a society which has the same remarkable continuity over the last 30 years that China has. In China, the continuity is an annual growth rate of GDP in the 4, 5, 6, 7, 8% range, and the United States has nothing remotely like that. We're lucky here if we get 2%. Okay, but equally impressive is the growing inequality of the United States. You know, at the end of World War II, we were less unequal than Europe. Now we have left Europe in the dust in the level of inequality that we have, income inequality, wealth inequality. So, it's a capitalism that is unable to do here in the United States what it promised its people across the 20th century. And I really am evidence of that. That's what they taught us in the elementary school. That's what they taught us again in high school. That's what I learned at the university. And that's what I was told when I got my PhD in economics. That the remarkable thing about capitalism is the immense middle class it produced and it sustains. It's all gone now. The confidence is gone. The reality has completely changed. The middle class isn't there anymore. It's literally gone. It's so obvious that even our conventional politicians who specialize in admitting nothing and saying nothing attack each other on the grounds that their enemy is destroying the middle class and their goal is to bring back the middle class. Everybody says it, nobody does it. It's a little bit like every president I counted back, I believe 8 or 9, promised to bring manufacturing back to America. Every president, Republican, Democrat, promised it. Absolutely none of them did it. And it doesn't make any difference. The next election, they're busy promising at each other and attacking each other for not having done it, not recognizing the contradiction that they're all guilty of that situation. They have no way out, and there's none on the horizon. The shrinkage of the United States is evident wherever we turn. I'm going to strongly state what Mr. Trump has done has irreducibly and irreversibly altered the global economic situation. It's too late now. He's done the damage. How he manages the damage and how his successors manage the damage. That's more open. But let me briefly summarize the damage. Every country on this planet and every company that either buys from or sells to the United States, and that is many, many companies in every country across the world has now undertaken, it's already done a rethinking of their business model, of their plans, of their investments. And the reason is simple. The United States has shown the world that it is dangerous to depend on the United States for anything you buy, for anything you sell. Their political leaders, and by the way, this includes the Democrats who by their silence seem to be more or less not the enemies of what Mr. Trump is doing, adopting rather a wait and see. If it works out, well, we won't oppose it, because it's not politically cute for us to do. So, the rest of the world sees Mr. Trump without meaningful domestic opposition, yet able to what? Well, let's look at what Michael just said. To hurt them. To hurt them with a 10% tariff, a 20% tariff, sanctions maybe. If not sanctions on them, sanctions on people who do business with them. This is a whole-scale attack on them. It hurts them. It reduces their profits. It thereby reduces the taxes they pay to their own governments. I could go on. If they have made a unilateral decision that leads every country and every company to start looking much more intensely at finding alternative sources of inputs and imports to those countries and alternatives to the United States as an export market just out of the logic of profit maximization and the logic of risk minimization, which are the rules of capitalist businesses. And they're not going to change that unless there were a virtual revolution in the United States in which an alternative political leadership emerged that clearly and powerfully had an alternative plan that did not involve tariffs, sanction, and there is no such thing. The second half of the 20th century and the first 20 years of this one have seen the leadership of Europe mostly dominated by what we call center-right political figures. And they have had one basic theme that the United States is wonderful, and the protector of everybody, and the evil is the Soviet Union, and now the evil is Russia, that our policy is self-protection. We're protecting you all, say these right-wing leaders, to their own people. Vote for us because we are the bosom buddies of the United States lined up via NATO to confront and contain the Soviet Union. Now, Russia. This policy is now dead. The United States has said to the whole of Europe, You can be anti-Russian if you like, but we're not playing anymore. We're not going to do all of this. We're not going to fight Russia and Ukraine anymore, etc., etc. That left the Europeans in power with half of a policy. Being close to the United States, they couldn't do any more because the United States was saying that the war in Ukraine was over, or a mistake, or a failure. So what they're left with is pure anti-Russianism. It's pathetic to watch. This is when you're riding half a bicycle. You know what happens if you ride half a bicycle? You fall over. You may take a few moments, but you're going to fall over because you need two and you only got one. The right wing in Europe is desperate. Pay attention to how they talk. You can see it. Their whole policy is ferocious anti-Russianism, which is why they line up behind Zelensky and other odd choices. But here's an important point comes from what Michael just said about Argentina. While they're doing all this, they are in fact more and more dependent on China. The Europeans need to cultivate China. And I think if you see now the decision move their assets and invest heavily in military production, at the expense, therefore, of the European standard of living, because what else can they do? You're setting up conditions for what Michael said, for a rapid, sharp, left-wing shift of power in Europe. The conditions for it, the political parties to articulate, are all in place. What has to happen is a recognition, particularly by the business communities there, that just like in Argentina, they don't want to lose the business with China, which is crucial. The same is true for the actual and the potential business of Europe and China, which the difficulties with the United States, ironically, make more urgent for Europe than they were before. They are among the countries I referred to before that are rethinking and have to. And if the right-wing leadership is too compromised to do it, then the left-wing leadership will become attractive to the business community, which will oppose it less than they used to. And that's probably all the left there needs to come into power. How they will use such a power, I don't know. I don't think they do either. But you can see the reorganization of the world economy that Nima is asking is happening for Europe as well, because they're not immune. Everything that we have been saying apropos of the strategy towards China, at least for the last 15 years, and maybe longer. The policy of the United States has been regime change in China. Not just in Russia, in China. They would like China to be a cooperative, subordinate but powerful member of the community of capitalist nations. That's what they would like. And they've taken many steps, and they've said that over and over again. The standard story in Washington that I hear from the people I know there because of my education. I know a lot of these people, they were my schoolmates and so on, has always been the same. Get, quote, China to be a proper member of the community of nations. That's why we brought them into the World Trade Organization. That's why Kissinger and Nixon went there in the first place in the 1970s. And we have had to vary our policy. But that's what we want. They should become more and more private in their hybrid mix of private and state enterprises. They should therefore become more dependent on monetary and fiscal policy rather than the more direct interventions that they practice in their economy. And that's all. Now they want to use tariffs because the other mechanisms of pressuring them in that direction failed. It didn't work, and it's clear they are not about to work either. They've become too rich too fast and too big too fast. You haven't got levers of power over them. Okay, now you're going to use, here comes the desperation again. You're going to use the last big club you have to get them to do that. And they're letting you know by everything Michael just said, they're not going to do it. It's not going to work. You waited too long. You might have tried this 30 years ago, but not now. Can't do it now. Too late. And if you look at the Chinese, not only in terms of what they've done in their country, but having crafted, and I mean crafted the BRICS as an allied nation, wow, that is an extraordinarily crucial because where will China go if they can't trade with the United States? If Mr. Trump carries it through and really does isolate them, the answer is the BRICS. That is their first defense to reorganize their imports and exports, which those BRICS countries will be having to do too. Both sides having to reconnect out of the U.S. into their own. I read a speech the other day, I believe, of Mr. the Treasury Secretary in which he advises the Chinese, by the way. The arrogance is overwhelming. But he advises the Chinese to be less export-dependent and to do more to develop their internal market. Well, only a person who has no idea what the Chinese have been doing for 20 years would say such a thing because they've been doing that for 20 years. That is why the real wages in China have gone up 4 times over the last 25 years, while America's real wages have been stagnant for the same 20 years. Here it is. Of course, they're building their domestic. But they also have allies. They do not actually have to depend totally on their domestic, because they really have allies, and the tariffs, by being uniform, are pushing all their allies to work closer with China to become a self-sufficient world economic power. And since they are now larger than the West, that they have more of a power base economically speaking than the West does, and they have shown the capability of doing the most advanced technological breakthrough, you are looking at a split world economy where the odds are better for China to come out on top of that than for the United States. And all the make-believe in the world isn't going to change that. But let me spell out a scenario, and it's only a possibility. I don't believe in predicting the future. I'm not telling anyone what I'm about to describe is going to happen. But I am telling you it might happen. And here's the reason I think so. It comes out of American history. When Franklin Roosevelt, early in the Depression, ran for president, he ran as a middle-of-the-road conventional Democrat. He advocated a balanced budget. Even in the middle of the kind of crash that he was living through at the whole country, he went to the left because the mass of people went to the left in the United States. Huge numbers joined 2 socialist and 1 communist party, and they all together mobilized and were the militants of the CIO, which was the greatest unionization drive in all of American history before or since. Okay, they then went to Mr. Roosevelt and said, "You have to move to the left with us or we're voting you out of office. You're not going to stay here." He understood the argument. They had mobilized millions of people. They could control those votes. He'd be out, his political future finished. So he went with them out of opportunism. No question about it. But what did he do? He created then, under the pressure from below Social Security, which we never had before, a government pension program, a minimum wage which we never had before, an unemployment compensation program at the federal level, which we'd never had before. And he hired 15 million people on the government payroll, which we had never had before. Spectacular changes. Okay, why am I telling you this? Because if we now, at the end of the desperate gestures of Mr. Trump, generate a global inflation recession, or the stagflation that more and more are contemplating is coming, he may well have what Michael referred to before when he had a slip. He meant the word recession if you heard at the beginning of the program, but out came depression. Yeah, exactly. There's more wisdom there than there is a slip of the tongue. Okay, what's going to happen? The mass of people are going to go to the leaders of the BRICS countries and say, "We now need salvation from stagflation. The United States is the cause. China might be the solution, and out of that would come what I described before, an accommodation." Despite center-right or other leaders in BRIC under, they would either have to accommodate the way Roosevelt had to, or they'd have to get out of the way because other forces will make that claim. I don't think that's fanciful anymore. Do I say it's going to happen for sure? Of course not. I can't predict the future any better than anybody else can, which is to say, we cannot. But is that a possibility emerging here? Absolutely. It is a possibility. And it is a possibility that would address obstacles to the process that's already underway, but that the United States wants to hold back to prevent even to reverse that it cannot do. And that makes this scenario possible in the future despite the heterogeneity of BRICS governments, their difference from the Chinese and so on, and I wouldn't discount it. I think you're seeing I'm amazed at how fast everything is going. There are now, in the mainstream of the American financial press, constant stories. There were half a dozen this morning before I came into our program here, in which the decline of the dollar as a safe haven, the decline of U.S. Treasuries as a safe haven. Here we are in a period of turmoil. Here we are with an imminence of recession. And where's the money going? Not into the dollar. It's not the safety. It's not the riskless asset that it used to be. It's the more in-depth analysis of the stories that shape our world.